All right, I've been told that I can defrag the crowd, so I like that term. If anybody's on the periphery wants to scrunch in, you're welcome to do that. You don't have to. I'm here to talk about Ingress, mobile game. How many folks out there are familiar with Ingress as a game? Awesome, that rocks. So this is the story section of GDC. So I'm going to talk about the ways that we've tried to incorporate story and what I think are some novel ways into a mobile gaming experience. So just to warm you guys up and to provide a little bit of background on Ingress for those of you that aren't familiar, we've got a real short video here.
Incoming message.
So we'll show kind of what the gameplay is like.
You are under attack.
I need to get these fields up.
In some ways, Ingress is a war, where we have two sides and we're competing.
So for those of you who are new to Ingress, it's a really great game where you capture territory by throwing links from one portal to another.
If we let that link go, it will ruin half of the operation.
I'm gonna link.
Oh, whoa, 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 whoa.
We're not going to do that until France confirms they are ready to link.
Hey, we're on top of the mountain. 3 links create a field, and within that field, the more people that live, the more points that you get for your team.
I was amazed that Tom kept going.
I just made a link.
Tom was making more links at the end than I was.
You're right there with your other teammates and just constantly battling.
We're getting down to the wire. This could be a deal breaker for us.
All right, so that's the basic idea of Ingress. It's an outdoor MMO, and it's your chance to be Jason Bourne with your cell phone. How did we end up there? So this project started at Google about 3 years ago. A bunch of us came out of the Maps and Earth team, and we wanted to make a game. We looked at the industry. We looked at kind of where things were headed in terms of platform, moving from traditional consoles to mobile, obviously. And then we're looking beyond that. We had seen early prototypes of Google Glass, talk about other kinds of wearable computing devices, and that seemed to mesh well with our notion of a game that you played not sitting inside, but moving around out in the real world. You know, part of the inspiration for this, frankly, is my own family. I grew up with games, playing games. Games led me into programming, which led me into all kinds of awesome things in my life. But I see my kids, even playing a great game like Minecraft, which I love and I play with my kids, you know, it's still a sedentary indoor activity. It's kind of ironic that this talk is coming right on the heels of the Writing for VR talk. But I mean, some facts, kids globally on average spend 3 hours per day, in the developed world, 3 hours per day with a screen. 80% of kids and 30% of adults don't get the recommended amount of daily exercise. And this has very bad health effects. Lack of exercise kills as many people every year as smoking, little known fact. So the idea was, maybe we can do something about that. Maybe we can use the motivational power of games, the incentive, the feedback loop of games, couple that with playing and exploring in the real world to build something new. So fundamental idea, take the world, turn it into a game board. What points on the earth are you going to make your game out of? I mean, we could certainly make a game where all the Starbucks in the world are the points that you're sort of dealing with and interacting with. But, you know, we thought, maybe that's not the best thing to do. Maybe we could take cultural landmarks, interesting art, for example, historical sites, historical markers, for example, and use those kinds of places as the fundamental map that people are playing. If you're going to lead people out into the real world, our thought was, why not lead them somewhere interesting? Somewhere where you might learn something or be exposed to something new or just have an awesome, moment sitting peacefully in the park in front of some weird, crazy statue. So that's what we did. We seeded the database with what we could pull together ourselves, and then we asked our players to go out and find cool, interesting places in their cities and communities and submit them back. And today that forms what we kind of jokingly refer to as our database of the world's most interesting places. But you know, mostly non-commercial, cool places all around the world. 10 million have been submitted. 3 million are part of our current base map. That got us to Ingress. We just passed our 10 million download mark. It has been a slow and steady increase of awareness for this new type of game, but we're pretty happy with the progress that we've made. It's being played in over 200 countries around the world. And you know, as for those of you that are players and are familiar with the community or saw from the video, lots of social activity and lots of international contact and collaboration between players. Okay, so this is the writing track. Story. How does story come in? Basically, we knew we wanted to make a game on a phone taking place in the real world. And we really wanted to add some emotional resonance to that. And we felt like, yeah, you could try to insert story into a mobile phone screen, but we're thinking about a situation where people are active and in motion. Maybe it's not the best environment for them to really take in a story, to pay attention to the story. So we began to think about how can we break outside of the app? How can we create an immersive world that would add some richness to the story but be delivered in a way that wasn't necessarily in the traditional way of sort of cutscenes inserted into a game? You know, growing up, my favorite genre of games were like text adventure games, like the old Infocom games. So we wanted to add, you know, story of that kind of level of emotional connection. So our initial plan was to do that through several mechanisms, to deliver a story through social networks, Google+, Twitter, Facebook, to make use of YouTube, and to supplement that with books and comic books kind of coming in on the outside in a more traditional narrative form to give people a way kind of into our universe. We looked at ARGs. How many of you guys have played or are familiar with alternate reality games? So these games that represent that they're not a game at all, and there are websites scattered all around the internet. One of the creators of that genre is here, Jim Stewartson, who's now part of our team. Jim, right here. I Love Bees and Why So Serious and a number of other projects. We looked at that, and we basically decided to evolve that a little bit and make the center point of delivery of the story social networks, because people on mobile, how are they getting information? They're going to their feeds every day. So I guess you could call what we're doing sort of ARG light. It's taking that story, putting it out into the stream, and by the way, adding lots of interesting content into it, puzzles that can be solved, and importantly, rewards that tie back into the mobile game. So as you read the story, become involved in it, and maybe become involved in the puzzle solving side of it, a key thing was to link that back into the game so that your status, your progress, the items that you have to work with are increased by your participation in the story itself. So books. You know, we ended up hiring some really talented writers to basically start developing this world. And as we got into it, we found that, you know, we had lots of fragments of story, but there were people out there who really had a hard time following the narrative solely in that fragmented way. So one of the things that we decided early on to do was to basically take the narrative and tell it in a more traditional way through ebooks. And I can tell you is actually, once you've invested in narrative, it's actually relatively inexpensive to bring that to market as an ebook. A few $1,000s you can, you know, once you have your content, once you have the story written, it's pretty easy to publish. And it's a great way to augment something like an ARG, which can be confusing for a lot of people. That's what we found. So we've actually come out with a series of books, some written solely by the in-house team and some in collaboration with outside authors like Tom Granius, who's a best-selling adventure type author. And we also did a comic book. So we found that comics were a great way to onboard, you know, users who weren't interested in sitting down and plowing through a 100 or 200-page novel. So these were nice supplemental ways to basically enrich, create a universe that people could explore. So, kind of how has it worked out? What we found is, number one, people will go outside to play a game. So there were people that disputed that notion. Even here at GDC a couple of years ago, there was kind of a debate about it. I think at this point with Ingress, one thing is unequivocal, and that is that people get a lot of enjoyment from playing outside. We see people doing things as simple as taking their baby to the park in a baby stroller, literally, and playing Ingress along the way. People renting helicopters and airplanes on operations, literally calling in an airstrike with a real airplane in an Ingress battle. People flying to remote islands, remote parts of the world. So exploration and video games go together very nicely. Exercise. So we didn't really think about Ingress as a fitness app or something designed to motivate exercise directly. We thought activity, but not necessarily fitness. But what we found is a lot of people were using it, a lot of gamers, a lot of people who just came to that app who weren't necessarily gamers, but it was their nudge every day to get outside. And we found ourselves getting a lot of positive feedback from people who were losing weight and generally just feeling better because the app was pulling them outside. And frankly, I think a lot of the reason that Ingress has gotten traction with folks is because of this physical movement that it sparked in many people. And of course, there are players that took that far beyond just going for a walk or run. And we've seen people climb mountains. This group of French players in the lower right-hand corner of the screen there have climbed this 9,000-foot mountain 2 years in a row to capture the portal at the top. The Italians in the middle actually climbed 3 mountains on a single day, each above 8,000 feet, to capture a portal that was at the top of each one. We have people that have walked literally thousands of miles. Valerie Wallace, who's in the left-hand bottom corner, has walked over 1,600 miles, I think, at this point. And we have an agent in France who's walked over 4,000 miles, I believe, the distance from Paris to Cape Town, South Africa. He's walked playing Ingress. And many, many stories flowing about people doing things they wouldn't ordinarily do, motivated by a video game. So that all worked out pretty well. One of the questions we had going into this was the social aspect of things. We felt like people would probably play the game with their friends, folks they knew at school, folks they knew at work. We weren't sure what would happen when people who were playing the game came together in real life. I mean, what happens if you have a portal and strangers walk up at the same time and they're playing the game on their phone? We really didn't know. As it turns out, they talk to one another. They formed communities. Over 4,000 Ingress communities have been formed in cities around the world. So events and social gatherings became, if exercise is one sort of cornerstone for the success of the project, I think the social side of it and events are the other. And we've seen events basically grow over the last couple of years from small gatherings originally to 1,000 people, 2,000 people. We had 1,000 people at this event in Taiwan. We didn't know if anybody was going to show up. We sent one person over, and over 1,000 people showed up in their Ingress garb, ready to go. It was a fantastic event. We just finished up an event in Florence, Italy. Last year in Tokyo, we had our largest event ever. Over 5,000 people showed up on that day to play. This is about 40 seconds showing you kind of what these events are like if you haven't been to one. So as we were figuring out events, and as I said, we kind of stumbled into that strategy. We were doing that at the same time we were figuring out how to weave the narrative more tightly into the gameplay experience. So when we first started events, it was basically just a brainstorm. We're sitting around, the 4 or 5 folks on the creative side of the project, And we thought, well, let's try a meetup. And if we're going to do a meetup, we thought, let's make gameplay have something to do with the meetup. Let's have an effect on the narrative based on which faction wins or loses at this meetup. So on kind of a lark, we picked a site. It's the Cahokia Mounds Park outside of St. Louis, Illinois. It's an American Indian remains site. And this was January of 2013. We really didn't know if anybody would show up. We announced the event on social media. About 75 people showed up in freezing sleet and rain, played all day. The factions competed with one another. The Enlightened won that day, which is one of the two teams. And we had said that one of the primary characters in the game, a researcher kind of behind the project, Hank Johnson, his affinity for the Enlightened or the Resistance would be determined based on which faction won that day. And it was a huge hit with players. They loved the idea that they were actually shaping the narrative through their gameplay. And so the basic formula that we settled on was a lot like the Choose Your Own Adventure books that we all read and played in junior high school. Basically, the events are these punctuation points in the story where things can go one of two major directions. And we basically put the fate of our characters and the story in the hands of our players. That's kind of scary because as writers, it means that we really have to be prepared for different outcomes and to plan for them, and in some cases to write them, and be prepared to roll with that in real time based on what happens on any given day. But in general, this is, it's worked out well for us. Players seem to really like it. The whole idea of events and how they work has matured. And now we've kind of settled on a pattern which I think works pretty well, which is to think of these as seasons, each one running 3 months. So that's our story arc. That's our equivalent of like a television season, I guess. So some major new development in the story happens. We set it up. Players compete over it, and it's resolved during the course of 3 months or so with a climactic event at the end, deciding something significant in the story. And we've seen attendance and involvement in these events go up over time. The logos and identity of the events are a major part of player engagement. They're part of player-created swag and items. So the season tempo is working quite well. I want to hit quickly on 8 other things that we did in response to kind of learning what was working and wasn't working in terms of integrating story and gameplay. So the first of those is the shard game. So as the events were beginning to take form, we still weren't totally happy with the integration of the actual gameplay in the client with the story. So we added a whole nother level of gameplay into the application that would be even more closely tied to the narrative, to the fiction. And in that, we created virtual objects. We scattered them around the globe. They were pieces of a character who basically got exploded into his component parts in the fiction. And players were asked to try to reassemble this character. The two factions were pitted against one another, and they were trying to get these globally dispersed pieces either to San Francisco or Buenos Aires, Argentina. So this shard game has now been replayed in a number of forms over the course of the last few seasons, and there's a new iteration of it starting now. It was a really great overlay that allowed us basically another tool to write fiction and have gameplay basically intertwined very tightly with it. It's motivated a lot of cool stuff, people flying in airplanes to remote corners of the planet to try to block these shards from being moved. And the first time we ran it, we had a really great finale here in San Francisco where folks were trying to move the shards in from Russia to get them here to win on behalf of the Enlightened. This is a brief audio recording from Zello, an app called Zello. It's a push-to-talk app, as they were trying to complete the movement of these virtual items.
Hello, Eagles. Moscow here. Do you read me?
I'm guessing they're all getting in place right now, but we can hear you quite fine on Zello.
Confirming we're at the position right near the Fitzgerald Nature Reserve.
Magadan link is online. Be ready. It's now T-minus 20 minutes. Arrival in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. Please scroll.
Madly refreshing. Wait one.
Hey, Vitaly, I just wanted to tell you thank you for this. Your team was incredibly awesome, and I watched you play tag with those shards for weeks in Siberia, and every day I was not disappointed when you kept ahead of the Smurfs, and I'm glad you brought it home.
So that kind of international play and cooperation was one of the awesome outcomes of that shard game that we laid in. Vitaly, by the way, is a former ICBM launch officer in the Russian military. So when he was moving the shards, he said that very authoritatively. Very, very interesting guy. So second thing, YouTube. So we didn't really understand YouTube in the beginning. Originally, we used it just to drop fragmentary ARG story. And it worked in that context, but it wasn't getting the story to the maximum number of users, and we found some other ways that we could use it. The first thing we did is we integrated the media that we were creating into the game client itself, so that when you interact with a portal, sometimes the thing that you get out of it is an element of media, a YouTube clip, for example. That worked pretty well. It worked even better when we used the YouTube API and integrated the playback directly into the client, so that you never left that client experience, but you got that hit of story. The other thing that we did is, again, in the spirit of kind of helping people onboard and understand the story, to catch up to this fragmentary ARG style of storytelling, is we created a weekly YouTube show that would basically recap everything that was happening with events, with the competition between the two factions, and with the effect on the narrative. So this weekly kind of catch-up show on YouTube has become kind of the spine of storytelling that basically keeps everybody on the same page as we're moving forward. So let me play just a few seconds of that, just so you get a sense of that.
You are an artist. Your medium is change.
Hello, agents. I'm Susanna Moyer, and this is the Ingress Report. I'm reporting from the Shonin Anomaly here in Austin, Texas. Today we will find out what the significance of the Shonin Stone is and how it will impact the world of Ingress. Over 6,000 agents rose to the challenge today in an attempt to capture the first Shonin anomalies. As the first Shonin anomalies concluded around the world, the Enlightened emerged victorious. It was captured by the Enlightened! Earlier today, I received a video from a woman claiming that the Enlightened leader Roland Jarvis has died. She purports to have studied with him, and is also claiming that she is the new ascendant leader of the Enlightened movement.
And they reduced our leader, Roland Jarvis, to a shadow of himself, passing the torch to me, his acolyte.
So you get the idea. It's a catch-up on gameplay, and then it's explaining to people what is going on with the story. So if you don't play Ingress for a couple of weeks, and you want to catch back up in terms of what's going on, all you have to do is watch a couple of episodes of the Ingress Report, and you're kind of back on the main line of the story. 3 out of 8 recaps. So this is a timeline that is a real timeline. In other words, the timeline for the story started 2 years ago. So people that are joining today, it's really important, we found, to give people a way to understand what's happened before they began to engage with Ingress. So we've done that in a couple of ways. There are some books that basically pull all of the ARG assets together into kind of a magazine-style book that's an ebook. Great way to catch up. And we've also, at the end of year 1 and year 2, done YouTube shows that basically explain everything that happened up to that point. So that's your binge watching of Person of Interest on Amazon. That's your way to kind of get into the flow if you're coming to this after it's already begun. 4 out of 8 characters who appear across all of our media. We found it's really effective to have them appear at events, interact with players. But the key sort of learning for us was it worked even better when we made that an achievement in the app. So we have characters that appear in YouTube videos, in the book, in the comic book. Players meet them at events. They really loved it when they met that character, they could get a card from him, and that unlocked an achievement in the game. So tying everything back to progress within the game and achievements within the game was a key learning. One of the other things we did is we created this fictional concept that could stripe across both the fiction and the app called glyphs. So we basically invented our own symbolic language. This is the way the entity that's out there, the shapers, are communicating with us. And we laid pipe for this through assets, through videos, in the graphic novel. We even included some of these in Google Maps, so we had them photographed from the Google plane so that they would appear. This one's still there. You can still find it. But the payoff for all of that was we wanted to have a mini game in the app so that when you interacted with portals, there was some gameplay involved. And that was all a lead up to launching glyphs within the app. And so players loved the idea that they had been sort of brought into this lore through the story, but ultimately it paid off in something that they could do in the app, and it allowed them to progress and earn points and be a more effective player in the app. Another thing we did were missions. So in a traditional role-playing game, you go talk to the innkeeper, you're sent out on a mission. It was hard to translate that into Ingress. We ultimately figured out a way to do it through UGC. So players can create missions in their city, town, all around the world. We've had a few 100,000 of these created to date. And we encourage players to basically use story and basically kind of do fan fiction to create missions. So wherever you are in the world, you can play an Ingress mission, and often you can find one that's based on story. So you get that immersion in a structured way, but players help us flesh that out, so all over the world it's there. We couldn't possibly author content for every city, for every country in the world. So that was really only doable by figuring out a way to harness players in UGC to do that. You can't remind people enough times about the story, and you can't summarize enough. So another thing that we did that was very effective is introduce this concept of news of the day. So every day when you log on to the product, almost every day, you're shown a short snippet. So there's a single sentence that's going to summarize the highlight of what's happening within the game that links back out to social media where you can get a more complete version of that if you want. And the last thing we did that I think is interesting and worth pointing out is anything you can do to make your story physically manifest, players are really excited about. So we actually bought a van, not as expensive as you might think, and sent it back and forth across the country. So sometimes it appears at our events. It often does meetups on its own. It's now done over 162 events and traveled over 38,000 miles in 1 year. It's written into the fiction. It belongs to the NIA, the National Intelligence Agency. It appears in our YouTube videos, and players get hugely excited when it rolls into their small town in Kansas, and they can see it and touch it and have a meetup kind of centered around it. So all those things together, the story and the mobile game, I think the combination of movement and social and an immersive fiction have really touched a chord with players. We've seen dozens of people get one of the 2 faction logos tattooed on their body at this point. We were shocked when this first started occurring, while the product was still in beta, but it's still going on today. Of course, we've seen engagements. So, it's one thing when people meet and get married sort of virtually, their avatars in, an online environment. But we're seeing real romances struck up. And recently, we saw the very first baby attributed to the game, which is kind of cool. There's a very touching story from the father about how he and his partner met playing Ingress, and now they have this beautiful child. So at this point, it's really, it's soon going to be in your hands. We've tried to pioneer this new genre to prove the point that you can get people outside to play a game, that they'll enjoy it. We've experimented with ways to use narrative to reinforce that and make it more powerful. We are in the process of readying an API so that other folks can make games like this. I am confident there are people in this room that can do an even better job of designing and making a game and telling a story than we did. And we're really excited to put these tools in your hands soon. So that's what we're doing at Niantic with Ingress.